Naval aviation, 1919 to 1940. In two previous talks, I recounted the development of naval aviation in the Great War, at the end of which Britain was the world leader in this form of warfare, and the unhappy experience of the British fleet air arm between the wars. Briefly, for anyone who wasn't at the second talk, the fleet air arm was part of the RAF, the Royal Air Force, rather than the Royal Navy, from 1919 to 39. The RAF gave it a low priority, which caused all sorts of problems and left the British well behind at the start of World War II, especially in regard to aircraft development. I shall now talk about the other navies that had a significant air component between the wars. This essentially means the United States and Imperial Japanese navies, but first I will mention the French Navy's aspirations, which will not take long. So France. The only carrier that the French had between the wars was the Bayonne. She was originally laid down as a Normandy-class battleship in 1914, but construction was suspended during the entire war. In 1920, French officers visited the Royal Navy's HMS Argus, which I covered in previous talks, and decided that they wanted one like it. So Bayonne was selected for conversion. She was more comparable in size to the larger HMS Eagle, which had a displacement of 22,000 tons and was just coming into service, with a starboard island rather than Argus's flat deck. But Bayonne's weakness was always her speed of only 21 knots, due to two of her four engines being triple expansion rather than turbine. Her deck cliffs were slow in operation and required separate doors flush with the deck to allow operations to proceed while they were in use. Her career suffered from lack of financial and political support to an even greater degree than the Fleet Air Arm. She played minor roles in some of France's colonial wars before World War II. In June 1940, she disembarked all her aircraft and was sent off to the United States with 145 tons of gold to protect the French currency reserves and partly also to pay for new aircraft. At Halifax, Canada, she embarked 15 Curtiss Mohawk fighters, some Stinson light observation aeroplanes, and 44 Curtiss SBC Helldiver dive bombers. These were a biplane type, not to be confused with the better-known Helldiver of later in World War II. After the French armistice, she was ordered to put into Martinique. Her aircraft were put ashore and left to rot. After the dissolution of the Vichy government, she was deliberately run aground and partly flooded, and eventually refloated and towed to New Orleans for repairs. After the war, she picked up new aircraft and returned to France, colliding with an American troop ship on the way. Her low speed meant that by this time she could not launch modern aircraft, so could only function as an aircraft transport. She ferried aircraft to support the French forces in Indochina in the early 1950s, and was later used as a depot ship and accommodation ship. Bizarrely, she outlasted all the other carriers in this talk, not being scrapped until 1967. So the United States. For much of my information on the United States Navy, I'm indebted to David Hobbs's book, The Dawn of Carrier Strike. I could have produced a talk from other sources, but not in as much detail. During the Great War, the United States Navy and the Naval Department in Washington had been watching British progress with interest. After the USA entered the war in 1917, Royal Navy constructor Stanley Goodall was seconded to the US Bureau of Construction and Repair. He shared many details of the British developments and aspirations for naval aviation, including the current HMS Argus and Furious, and plans for the projected Hermes and Eagle. The United States Navy was unable to prioritise carrier development before the end of the war, as there were too many competing urgent priorities. But in terms of developing modern aircraft, they were well ahead of the US Army. The Army had to rely entirely on British and French aeroplanes during the war for combat purposes, unless you count the Curtiss JN3s used, not terribly successfully, in Mexico against Pancho Villa in 1916. However, the Navy's Curtiss H-12 and H-16 flying boats were used in the North Sea and Western approaches by the United States Navy and Royal Naval Air Service, sinking at least one submarine. The first crossing of the Atlantic by air, completed on 27th of May 1919, was by a United States Navy Curtiss NC flying boat. Though unlike Alcock and Brown a month later, they stopped at the Azores and had the backup of destroyers spaced all across the ocean, which picked up the crews of the three boats that did not make it. Immediately after the war, as in every other country, the United States government was reluctant to spend more money on the Navy, so the idea of building an aircraft carrier from scratch was temporarily shelved, but money was allocated to the conversion of a vessel into an experimental carrier. This resulted in the USS Langley, pennant number CV1, which was roughly equivalent to Britain's Argus in terms of both size, design, and its role in developing techniques of carrier operation. It was named after aviation pioneer Samuel Langley, whom the Smithsonian Institution believed had built an aeroplane that flew before the Wright brothers, a belief that still has its supporters. The Langley was converted from the Navy collier USS Jupiter, which was the first US Navy vessel to have a turboelectric power plant. One of Jupiter's sister ships was the USS Cyclops, best known for disappearing in the Bermuda Triangle, albeit probably due to its cargo shifting in a storm rather than being kidnapped by UFOs. Langley re-entered service after conversion in March 1922. She displaced 12,900 tons and her overall length was 542 feet. Her superstructure was removed and a flush full-length flight deck fitted. Argus had been converted from a liner, so it was relatively easy to create a hangar within the hull, the full length of the main deck. But because Langley's hull was divided into holds, the hangar area had to be on the weather deck immediately under the flight deck. This was not ideal as there were other obstructions, and the hangar sides were open, leading to her nickname of the covered wagon. But it at least meant that aircraft engines could be run up with plenty of ventilation before lifting them to the flight deck. There was a lift to the flight deck, but it was impossible to make this go right down to the hangar floor, so aircraft had to be lifted the last few feet off the lift by crane, which slowed down operations. Rails were fitted under the hangar roof, so that a travelling crane could move aircraft along the hangar, and one hold was allocated for storing dismantled aircraft. Initially, lengthwise arrestor wires were fitted, as on the early British carriers. These were soon replaced by transverse wires requiring hooks on the aeroplanes. For a while, both types of wire were fitted, which made walking across the deck very difficult. Her smoke was vented through two funnels on the port quarter that folded down during flying operations, which created updrafts and were never ideal. At this point, there was no question in the US and the United States that naval aviation was to be administered by the Navy rather than the new Air Force. The head of the Bureau of Aeronautics was Rear Admiral William Moffat, and he had a major hands-on role in developing all the practical and administrative aspects of naval aviation in the post-war period. Unlike the Royal Navy, the US Navy positively encouraged officers, including senior officers, to qualify as naval aviators. If they were too old to easily pick up the coordination skills needed to become a pilot, they could qualify as naval aviation observers, which still gave them insight into aeroplane operations and capabilities. Moffat gained his observer wings at the age of 53. Sadly, in 1933, he was one of 73 men who died in the crash of the airship USS Akron, which came down in the sea in bad weather. Initially, the aircraft operated with a Vought VE7 two-seat general-purpose type. Due to the compromises inherent in her conversion, Langley was initially only able to operate 8 of them at once, as each aircraft had to be struck down into the hangar before another aircraft landed. Clearly, this number was insufficient to provide a useful spotting force for the fleet. This started to change in September 1925 when Captain Joseph M. Reeves took over command. Like Moffat, he gained his naval observer's wings aged 53. He was aided by his commander, John H. Towers, who had been one of the pilots on the transatlantic flight. Both later became 4-star admirals. Reeves spent the first few weeks in command watching the proceedings during flying operations. Then he gathered his officers together in front of a blackboard and said, "These are the problems that we have, how are we going to solve them?" What today would be called a brainstorming session, a highly enlightened and progressive management style for the day. First to go were the longitudinal arrestor wires. Then mechanics and aircraft handlers were divided into teams, each with specific duties, wearing coloured jackets to distinguish them from each other. They were drilled in their roles in launching or recovery of the aircraft to become ever more efficient. Pilots were trained as deck landing control officers, batsmen, guiding the aircraft down to land using signals with coloured bats. It wasn't until just before the war that the Fleet Air Arm introduced this system. Perhaps most importantly, Reeves introduced the barrier system, a wire netting barrier that was situated across the flight deck about 2/3 of the way towards the bow, in order that aircraft could be parked beyond it while other aircraft landed, without having to be struck down into the hangar. I couldn't find a photo of the system on the Langley. This diagram shows a much more sophisticated development of the concept. When an aircraft landed, if it successfully engaged an arrestor wire, the barrier was lowered so that it could cross into the parking area, and then the barrier was raised and locked in place in 3 seconds before the next aircraft landed. If an aircraft ran into the barrier, it slowed the operation down, but at least it was usually stopped from running into the other aircraft. This system continued until the angled flight deck was introduced in the 1950s. Also, from the late 20s, American naval aircraft were fitted with wheel brakes and caster and tail wheels rather than tail skids, several years before the British followed suit. The caster and tail wheels made deck handling a lot easier. More importantly, the skid had been the only brake, which meant that when the throttle was opened, the aeroplane started to move forward immediately and gathered speed slowly. With wheel brakes, it could be held on the brakes until takeoff revs were reached, and then accelerate much faster, which reduced the takeoff run considerably. This was especially important when an entire squadron was ranged on the flight deck to take off, and so the length of the flight deck in front of the leading aircraft was greatly reduced. With these changes, over 30 and sometimes over 40 aircraft could be operated from Langley. The Fleet Air Arm usually operated only about 20. On one occasion, Reeves demonstrated operating 20 aircraft from Langley to a British Vice Admiral. He pointed out to Moffat that he did not tell the Admiral that they normally operated at least 36 aircraft. It needs to be remembered that while both the British and Americans assumed that a war in the Pacific would be against Japan, United States naval policy for the Atlantic assumed that Britain would be the enemy. This continued until well into the 1930s, and for a lot longer in the minds of certain American admirals and politicians. So much for the special relationship, which has probably only ever existed in the minds of British prime ministers when they want something. I probably ought to mention the Mitchell trials for the sake of completeness. To go into detail would take at least a whole talk of its own, and it is somewhat of a digression as it was an army initiative, but some of you will expect me to mention it, and it was certainly a hot potato in naval thinking at the time. Brigadier General William Billy Mitchell of the United States Army Air Corps was one of those energetic and opinionated officers who was convinced that his ideas were better than those of his superiors, and had the strength of personality to get them to listen, rather like Jackie Fisher in the Royal Navy. Like Trenchard and many other early Air Force commanders, he was influenced by the Italian General Duhay, who wrote books prophesying that the bomber, i.e. fleets of bombers operating at high altitude, would be the decisive weapon of the future and would win wars on their own by devastating entire cities and naval battle fleets. Mitchell became insistent that large battleships were obsolete, as they could all be sunk by bombers alone, and as dive bombers were still in the future, this meant level bombing by conventional bombers. He managed to get permission to run a series of tests in Chesapeake Bay in July 1921. To simplify the story somewhat, they eventually managed to sink a few old destroyers and pre-dreadnought battleships. Of course, the targets were anchored and undefended and in poor condition, and the Army air crews had to borrow instruments from the Navy to even find them. They then brought along the surrendered German battleship SMS Ostfriesland. They attacked it with the largest bombs available, dropped from Handley Page 0400 and Martin MB2 heavy bombers over several days, with intervals to inspect the damage, and eventually it did sink. Again, it was static and undefended, and without damage control parties, and not in great condition. Photos show an explosion occurring due to an abyss alongside, which probably cracked the hull and caused the sinking rather than the direct hits. Mitchell also lobbied very hard to get the air components of the Navy and Army merged, as the British had done. President Coolidge set up an independent board under lawyer Dwight Morrow to consider the matter, and this concluded that the two forces should remain separate. Mitchell eventually got himself court-martialed and dismissed for insubordination over a different matter, but his ideas influenced naval and army air force thinking for the next 20 years. It is probably fair to say that Mitchell was right, but for the wrong reasons. Of course, aircraft did make battleships obsolete, but using torpedoes rather than bombs. In reality, it proves to be very difficult to sink a large battleship by bombs alone, or even by shellfire alone. If you try, you just knock chunks off the top. Unless you explode the magazines, however bad the upper damage, the vessel has to be finished off with torpedoes. I stand to be corrected here, but I believe that the only large battleships sunk by bombs alone, other than in tests, were the Arizona and the Tirpitz, which were both stationary targets. Arizona appears not to have been hit by torpedoes, but did suffer a magazine explosion. All the other ships sunk at Pearl Harbor were torpedoed, and most of them settled on the bottom and were raised and repaired and sent back into action. Tirpitz could not be attacked by torpedoes as it was in a fjord, but sinking it took 4 raids by 2 elite squadrons of Lancasters, each carrying 12,000-pound tallboy bombs. And even then, it is believed that the fatal damage was caused by very near misses that exploded in the water and cracked the hull, as with Ostfriesland. The Americans then leapfrogged the British and all other navies with their next 2 carriers, USS Lexington CV2 and USS Saratoga CV3, commissioned at the end of 1927. These were laid down as battle cruisers, which were cancelled due to the Washington Treaty of 1922, which sought to limit the number and total tonnage of battleships and battle cruisers that a navy could have, and which is another subject that could take up a talk on its own. The maximum displacement tonnage for a converted aircraft carrier was set at 33,000 tons. The Lexington and Saratoga came out at 36,000 tons, so the US Navy argued unconvincingly that the original limit applied to the ships before conversion. They were virtually the largest warships in the world. In terms of their length of 888 feet, they were slightly longer than Japan's Akagi or Britain's Hood, and about the same tonnage depending on how that is measured. They had turboelectric propulsion, giving them a top speed of 33 knots from 180,000 horsepower. And when the city of Tacoma ran short of hydroelectric power during a drought in 1929, Lexington was hooked up to the shore by power lines and supplied the city with electricity for a month. With that much power coming via steam turbines, the amount of smoke and fumes generated meant that there was no question of venting it over the side or by stern funnels, as on smaller vessels such as Argus and Langley. So, despite the misgivings about having islands to the side of the flight deck, the Lexington class had to have a proper funnel and island superstructure, which of course became the standard in the future. The hangar was integral with the hull rather than built on top of it, a feature not otherwise seen until Britain's Ark Royal of 1938, and was said to be the largest single enclosed space on any vessel afloat. They were capable of operating up to 90 aircraft, allowing a mix of fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft. Using the operational procedures developed on the Langley, the new carriers proved their worth. In a 1929 fleet exercise, Saratoga's aircraft carried out an attack on the Panama Canal, including dive bombing the lock gates, taking the defenders in the exercise completely by surprise. And if they'd been using real bombs, they would have crippled the canal. In fact, it was the US Navy that invented the concept of dive bombing as a way of striking a point target such as a ship. The Germans copied the concept after Ernst Udet saw a demonstration in the USA, and of course, so did the Japanese. The next carrier, CV4 USS Ranger, was built to only 13,000 tons for financial reasons during the Depression. And although she served throughout World War II, her size was considered a handicap. She therefore served in the Mediterranean rather than the Pacific during the war. She reverted to having side-mounted funnels and a separate flight deck. CV5 and CV6, Yorktown and Enterprise, which were commissioned in 1937 when the US economy had started to recover, had a more useful size of 25,500 tons. They also had the hangar on top of the strength deck, but otherwise were efficient, reliable, and practical designs which put the US Navy in a very good position for fighting the war with Japan, which was by then becoming inevitable. CV-8 USS Wasp was another slightly smaller vessel. Hornet, CV-9, commissioned just before the raid on Pearl Harbor, was a repeat of the Yorktown class. These vessels led directly to the Essex class, which formed the basis of US air power in the Pacific War after Midway, but they were later than the scope of this talk. Now for Japan. The only other navy to operate aircraft carriers between the world wars was the Imperial Japanese Navy. During the First World War, they were studying British developments with interest. In 1919, they started construction of their first carrier, the Hosho, which roughly translates as Flying Phoenix. She was built to a clean sheet design as an aircraft carrier, rather than being a conversion from a liner or warship. The British had previously commenced building the Hermes, which was the first carrier designed as such. But completion of Hermes was delayed until 1923 due to changes in the specification and strikes in the shipyards. The Japanese didn't have any nonsense with strikes, and so Hosho was completed a year earlier. She was somewhat smaller than Britain's Argus, at 552 feet long, with a displacement of 7,500 tons, and so could only carry about 15 aircraft. Initially, she had a small island on the starboard side, but it was too small to be useful and was in the way on such a small flight deck. So it was removed after a year or so, and thereafter the ship had a flat deck like Argus and Langley. She had 3 small funnels on the starboard side, which were folded flat over the water when aircraft were landing on. Like Argus and Langley, she was the carrier in which the Navy worked out all their operational procedures. Also like Argus, although she was the oldest and smallest carrier in her Navy by World War II, she saw action, albeit in the support role rather than with the battle fleet, and unlike almost all her younger replacements, she survived the war, only to be scrapped soon afterwards. Regarding aircraft, generally speaking, during and immediately after World War I, the Japanese Navy received assistance in training and equipment from the British, and the Japanese Army received assistance from the French. At the end of World War I, the Japanese had small quantities of aircraft such as Avro 504 trainers and Sopwith Baby seaplanes. With guidance and probably also salesmanship from the British naval mission, for initial operations on the Hosho, they acquired Gloucester Sparrowhawk fighters and Parnell Panther observation aeroplanes. The first Japanese-built naval fighter was the Mitsubishi 1MF, designed by Herbert Smith, who had previously designed the Sopwith Camel. There was absolutely no reason for Smith and others not to work for Japan at this stage. The British naval mission was initially an official British government operation, but it took an increasingly dubious course. I shall leave the details until the end, which is appropriate to the chronology, as well as making for an interesting postscript. In the meantime, Japanese design had progressively less input from Western manufacturers. When it came to building large aircraft carriers, the Japanese were in the same position as the Americans and British. The Washington Naval Treaty, which could also take up a talk on its own, limited the number of capital ships they could have, leaving them with spare hulls that could be converted to aircraft carriers if they did not exceed 35,000 tons. The Imperial Japanese Navy's largest partly built battle cruisers were the Akagi and Amagi, which had been laid down in 1920. Conversion of Amagi started first, but that vessel was damaged beyond repair in the Tokyo earthquake of 1923, which also killed a lot of the dockyard workers, and efforts concentrated on the Akagi, which was eventually commissioned in March 1927. With a displacement of barely under the 35,000-ton limit and a length of 855 feet, it was among the largest warships in the world, after Lexington and Saratoga and Britain's Hood. She originally had no less than 3 flying decks, the lower 2 exiting from the 2-deck hangar, and so only suitable for small aircraft taking off. The middle one probably very little use at all. Since her boilers generated too much smoke and heat to be vented from the stern, she had a somewhat grotesque funnel attached to the starboard side of the hull, which curved downwards towards the sea, and a smaller funnel also attached to the starboard side but directed upwards, which all made for a very smoky flight deck. Judging by the photo, the British among you, and possibly the Americans, will understand if I suggest that you may be eligible for compensation if you have owned or leased an Akagi-class aircraft carrier in the last 80 years. She had 10 8-inch guns, as well as 4.7-inch anti-aircraft guns. Most aircraft carriers of the time also had a cruiser armament, before it was realised that this would be fairly useless in practice, not least because of the effects of the blast on the aeroplanes and crew on the flight deck. She had a crew of 1,600 and originally about 60 aircraft. She was heavily reconstructed starting in 1935. Her lower flight decks were removed and 2 hangars extended into the space made available. The main flight deck became full length. She was also fitted with a small island, but unusually this was on the port side to avoid the smoke from the funnels. The reason that aircraft carrier superstructure is usually on the starboard side is that aircraft propellers rotated anti-clockwise when viewed from the front. Thus, on takeoff, the reactive torque causes the aircraft to tend to turn right, which a pilot would be able to control. But on landing, cutting the power would cause a turn to the left and would be more difficult to control due to the reducing rudder authority. And going into the water on the left would cause less damage in total than hitting the superstructure. The damaged Amagi was replaced by the slightly smaller Kaga, converted from a Tosa-class battleship, which had also been cancelled in order to comply with the Washington Treaty. Tosa herself was never completed and the hull was sunk as a target. Kaga originally had 3 flight decks with no island, like Akagi, but her exhaust gases vented via long ducts exited from the stern, which was just about tolerable on smaller carriers such as Argus and Furious, but on the more powerful Kaga, made for a very turbulent approach for landing aircraft and made the crew quarters unbearably hot. She was also reconstructed before the war, being given 1 full-length flight deck and a downward curving funnel on the starboard side of the hull like Akagi's. She was also given a small island put on the starboard side. Regarding the organisation of the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Force, my information comes from research by Paul Fontenay, from which I'm grateful. Any mistakes in the following are mine. This diagram is my attempt to portray the organisation. Each box represents a layer of command and contains the subordinate layer of command. The Imperial Japanese Naval Air Force differed from the US and Royal Navies in that it did not have independent squadrons of aircraft that were allocated to the ship and which retained their identity if transferred. A carrier or several carriers with attendant destroyers and cruisers as escorts comprised a Koku Sentai, roughly equivalent to a carrier task force. I don't guarantee the pronunciation of any of these words. A single carrier, all its aircraft and all the crew, both aviation and seamen, formed a self-contained unit known as a Kokutai, known by the name of the carrier, e.g. a cargo Kokutai. The aviation component of the carrier was known as the Hikokitai, which is subdivided into Hikobuntai, 1 for each type of aircraft, which by World War II would be fighter, dive bomber, and torpedo bomber. Hikobuntai is sometimes translated as squadron, but as mentioned just now, that is not strictly accurate. Unlike the Western navies, the combined Hikokitai of each carrier could be merged for operational purposes into Hikotai that integrated each carrier's Hikobuntai into Sentai-wide groups. Some Japanese cruisers that would be part of the Koku Sentai were adapted to carry a larger number of reconnaissance seaplanes than their Western equivalents, which was necessary to cover the vast distances of the Pacific. Unfortunately, this organisation proved to lack flexibility once war started. Another issue was that the flight crew, including pilots in the Imperial Japanese Navy, were much more likely to be enlisted men or petty officers than in the Western navies. Only about 10% were commissioned officers. Standards were still very high and training was rigorous with a high dropout rate, but loss of commissioned officers in combat led to obvious operational difficulties, especially as the Japanese deference to superiors did not encourage initiative. Like the Royal Navy, the Imperial Japanese Navy also did not develop a Batman deck control system until only just before the war. On the plus side, unlike the Royal Navy, the IJN did have control of the large patrol flying boats, such as the Kawanishi H-6K. It also had its own land-based medium bombers, such as the Mitsubishi G3M and later the G4M, which sank the Prince of Wales and Repulse using torpedoes on 10th of December 1941. In 1930, the Japanese launched their next carrier, the Ryujo. She was a small vessel of 7,000 tons, intended to use up the allocation of tonnage allowed by the Washington Treaty, and was not a success for that reason and because of stability problems. At this period, it seems that the Imperial Japanese Navy lost sight of the fact that naval vessels actually needed to be seaworthy as well as fight, sometimes in rough seas, and tended to design them with top-heavy superstructure and armament, resulting in a low metacentric height. After the new gunboat Tomazuro capsized in a moderate storm in 1935, they had to rapidly modify many of their vessels, including Ryujo. In the late 1930s, with the Washington Treaty dead in the water and all nations throwing financial constraints to the winds, the next two carriers were commissioned, the Soryo and Hiryu. They were close to being sister ships, though not exactly so, and were in many respects very fine vessels. They displaced around 20,000 tons, so smaller than the Akagi and Kaga, but essentially they were equivalent to the American Enterprise class. At the time, their size was around the optimum, large enough to be credible fighting vessels, but still reasonably economical to build and operate. They were intended to operate together, and Hiryu had her island on the port side, so that in theory, the two ships could operate side by side with their aircraft landing in opposite circuits so as not to collide. Two more Japanese carriers were commissioned just before the war, Shokeiku and Zuokeiku, which were similar to but slightly larger than Soryo and Hiryu. These then were the carriers with which the Imperial Japanese Navy entered the war. Almost all were involved in the strike on Pearl Harbor. They were a potent, credible, and experienced fighting force that fought with courage and skill. Their disadvantages were somewhat inflexible operational structure, some design flaws in the carriers that contributed to their loss, such as a vulnerable storage of aviation fuel, and aircraft which, although their performance was as good as Western types, were lightly built with ill armour. And of course, the Imperial Japanese Navy was outnumbered and overstretched, and its industrial base was less able to replace its losses than the Americans. Every one of the carriers listed above, except for Hosho, were lost during the war, and to replace them, the Japanese were reduced to converting merchant ships or cruisers, almost all of which were also lost. 4 of the carriers were lost at Midway, but that battle could easily have gone the other way, in which case history would have been very different. To conclude, I will return to the nefarious story of the British naval mission to Japan. This was originally an official British government initiative beginning in September 1921 and lasting just over a year, with the aim of bringing the Imperial Japanese Navy up to Western standards, particularly in carrier operations, by providing aircraft and advice. The British government must have realised that Japan could eventually become a threat to their interests, so their motivation for providing assistance is unclear. Possibly they felt that they needed a buffer against Bolshevik expansion in the Far East, but possibly also they wanted a counterbalance to the Americans. And of course, the cash certainly came in handy. The head of the mission was a Scottish aristocrat, William Forbes Semple. At the time, he held the title of the Master of Semple. After he inherited his father's title in 1934, he became the 19th Lord Semple. He had been a Royal Naval Air Service pilot during the war. He transferred to the RAF when it was formed and left the service after the war with the rank of colonel, which was an RAF rank at the time. He remained a keen pilot, and during the interwar period, he set several records flying light aircraft. After the Washington Treaty of 1922, the Japanese felt that they had been unfairly treated, relationships cooled, and the British naval mission was terminated. However, Semple continued as a freelance advisor to the Japanese and continued passing information to them, some of which was secret. He was investigated and questioned several times by British military intelligence, but nothing was done to stop him. He may have argued that Japan was not an enemy at the time, so he was doing nothing illegal, but he was certainly in breach of the Official Secrets Act. His motivation for his activities on behalf of Japan continues to be unclear. There may have been a financial element, but quite possibly he was the subject of flattery. He was made to feel more important by the Japanese than by his own country. Ideologically, during the 1930s, he had links to pro-German organisations. That, however, was true of many of the British upper class. They viewed the Soviet Union as more of a threat than the Nazis. But to be fair, when war broke out, they mostly knuckled down and did the right thing. Semple's assistant in the British naval mission was Squadron Leader Frederick Rutland, known as Rutland of Jutland. During the war, he had flown the only aerial reconnaissance over the Battle of Jutland, flying a short 184 seaplane from the seaplane carrier HMS Engadine. Unfortunately, Engadine was unable to send wireless reports of the reconnaissance to Beatty, but Rutland was awarded the DSC, the Distinguished Service Cross. Returning from the battle, Engadine picked up survivors from the armoured cruiser HMS Warrior. On returning to port, wounded men were loaded onto the quayside, but one fell out of his stretcher into the sea. Rutland jumped into the water to save him, despite the risk of being crushed between the ship and the quay, as well as drowning. For this, he was awarded the Albert Medal in Gold, equivalent to the later George Cross. So whatever his faults, he was a brave man, though possibly an impulsive one. But like Semple, after the end of the naval mission, he continued to pass information to the Japanese Navy. For some time, he was based in Honolulu, close to Pearl Harbor. The CIA were concerned about his activities and informed British intelligence, but again, nothing was done. By the time of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Semple and Rutland were both in London and were under surveillance by British intelligence. The telephone in Semple's London flat was bugged, and a week after Pearl Harbor, he was caught talking to the Japanese ambassador and arrested. And absolutely nothing happened. Churchill was convinced that Semple was a traitor, but Semple was a British aristocrat with friends in high places, and he got clean away with it. The only sanction was the expectation that he should withdraw from public life. It was not until the 1980s, long after his death, that files were released and his probable treason became general knowledge. Rutland, however, was interrogated at length and kept in custody, but he was never charged with anything and eventually released. Whether there was genuinely no evidence that he had broken the law, or whether they needed to protect Semple and others, who knows? But case files that were released in 2000 seem to confirm the damaging extent of his activities. He spent the rest of his life protesting that he had not betrayed his country. He was never again able to get a proper job, and he ended up living in a bedsit in Notting Hill. After the war, sadly, but perhaps inevitably, he took his own life. Lord Semple, however, died old, rich, and, as far as we know, happy.